Welcome to the Heartbeat Podcast, your trusted source for the latest breakthroughs and insights in cardiology. Here, we uncover the science behind every beat, bringing you cutting-edge research, expert discussions, and innovative approaches to heart health. Whether you're a medical professional, a curious learner, or someone passionate about understanding the heart's complexities, you're in the right place. So let's dive into today's episode and explore the pulse of modern cardiology together.
All right, so let's get right into it today. We are diving deep on a study that could change how we think about stroke prevention for people. You know those folks with atrial fibrillation who have had catheter ablation? It's a super recent article from the New England Journal of Medicine, just came out yesterday, November 16th, 2024. We are always trying to balance that stroke risk with bleeding risks from those blood thinners, right? Well, this study is looking at another option. It could really make that balancing act a lot easier.
Yeah, you're right on the money there. It is definitely a tough situation, a real dilemma. Both doctors and patients, they grapple with this all the time. Finding that perfect strategy for stroke prevention when you have atrial fibrillation is kind of like walking a tightrope.
So tell me a little bit more about the study. What exactly were they looking into?
Well, it's called the Option trial. And they investigated closing off the left atrial appendage with a device. That's LAAC. They wanted to see if that could be as effective as using blood thinners to prevent strokes. And the interesting part is that they were specifically looking at patients who had already had catheter ablation to treat atrial fibrillation.
So not just anyone with atrial fibrillation. These are people who already went through a procedure to try to get their heart rhythm back to normal.
Exactly. And don't forget, even after ablation, these patients are still at risk for stroke. So finding ways to protect them that are both safe and effective, that's really important.
Sure. So they're already dealing with atrial fibrillation, plus they have to recover from ablation. So it makes sense that researchers would be looking for ways to, make their lives a little bit easier, reduce those risks. Before we get into the details, though, remind me, why is this left atrial appendage so important?
Okay, so think of it as a small pouch. It's located in the left atrium of your heart. And in people with atrial fibrillation, this pouch, it can become a hiding place for blood clots. And if a clot forms there and then breaks loose, it can travel to the brain and cause a stroke.
Okay, that makes sense. So if you close off the pouch, you're basically eliminating a source of those dangerous clots. Pretty clever. So tell me about the Option trial itself. How many people were involved?
This wasn't a small study. They had over 1,600 patients across 106 different sites in 10 countries. So the researchers wanted to make sure that their findings were robust and could apply to a lot of different people.
Wow, that's impressive. They really went all in to get solid data. Right. What about the patients themselves?
So the average age was almost 70. All of them had atrial fibrillation and moderate to high risk of stroke. They used the CHA2DS2 VASC score to figure that out. And then they also assessed the risk of bleeding for each person using the HAF-BLD score. These are standard tools that doctors use to make treatment decisions. So
they weren't just picking people randomly. They had specific criteria to make sure they were focusing on the patients who would really benefit from this research.
Okay, so the million-dollar question, what did they find?
Well, when it came to bleeding complications, LAAC was the clear winner. Patients who had the LAAC procedure had a 56% lower risk of bleeding compared to those taking blood thinners.
Wait, 56%? That's a big difference. Was that for all types of bleeding, or were they looking at something specific?
That's a good question. The biggest reduction was in what we call clinically relevant non-major bleeding. So that means bleeding that needed medical attention. But it wasn't life-threatening.
So not like run to the ER bleeding.
Yeah.
That's still serious enough that you need to see a doctor. I can see how avoiding that would make a big difference in someone's life, especially if they're worried about side effects from blood thinners.
Exactly. And, a lot of people find taking blood thinners long-term to be pretty tough, both physically and emotional.
Okay, less bleeding with LAE, that's a big plus. But what about stroke risk? That's what we really want to know, right? That's the most important question, of course. And the results were really reassuring. When it came to preventing stroke, LAAC was just as good as blood thinners. No significant difference in the rates of stroke death or systemic embolism between the two groups.
So just to be clear, closing off this pouch was as good as taking blood thinners at protecting against those serious events. No increased risk at all.
That's what the study showed. And that's why this could be so groundbreaking. It suggests that for the right people, LAAC could be a game changer. Same stroke protection, but lower risk of bleeding complications.
Okay, we see that LAAC seems safe and effective, at least for this group of patients. Was there anything else interesting in the data?
One thing that caught my eye was the overall rate of ischemic stroke. That's the type caused by a clot. It was pretty low in both groups. Makes you think maybe the catheter ablation is playing a part in that lower stroke risk.
Oh, interesting. So maybe having that procedure to fix the irregular heartbeat is already lowering their risk, whether they get the LAAC or take the blood thinners. I see why you called this a potentially groundbreaking study. We've just scratched the surface here.
We've got a lot more to discuss. In part 2, we'll dive deeper into some of those details, explore what these findings might mean and what it all means for you and your healthcare decisions.
All right, so we've laid some groundwork here. We know from the option trial that LAAC could be a real option for preventing strokes, at least in people who have had catheter ablation for atrial fibrillation. But I'm guessing it's not quite as simple as saying LAAC is for everyone now, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This study gives us some great evidence, but we have to remember that everyone is different. There's no one-size-fits-all in medicine.
That makes sense. So how does this research actually change things between doctors and their patients? What should people be thinking about when they're making these choices?
I think this study really gives patients more power to be a part of their healthcare decisions. For a long time, blood thinners have been the go-to for stroke prevention. And while they work well for a lot of people, they also have downsides. Those bleeding risks, the lifestyle changes, the anxiety some people have.
Yeah, it's not always an easy choice. And honestly, I can see how some people might not want to question what their doctor recommends, but it seems like this research gives them more to work with, so they can have a more open conversation with their doctor about what's important to them.
Exactly. It's about moving away from that old way of doing things, where the doctor tells you what to do and you just follow. It's more about working together now.
So instead of just saying, here's your prescription, take this, doctors are having to say, let's talk about the good and bad of each option and figure out what's best for you.
Exactly. It's about understanding the patient's values, their preferences, their lifestyle, and then tailoring the treatment to fit them.
I like that. It feels much more personalized. But I'm wondering, are there any bigger implications here? Could this research actually change how entire healthcare systems deal with stroke prevention and atrial fibrillation?
It's definitely possible. As more research comes out and LAC becomes more accepted, we might see changes in those clinical practice guidelines, even insurance policies, and how medical professionals are trained.
So a kind of ripple effect?
Exactly. It starts with those one-on-one conversations, and then it can spread to the whole healthcare system.
It sounds like we could be on the edge of something really big here. But even with all this good news, I'm sure there are still some questions and challenges ahead. What are some things we still need to figure out about LAAC?
One big question is, how do we know who the perfect candidates for LAC are? The option trial looked at people who had already had ablation. But what about people who haven't? Do they get the same benefits?
Right, so we need more research to see if LACC works just as well in a wider range of atrial fibrillation patients. And what about the long-term effects?
Exactly. We need to know how LAC compares to blood thinners over time. How long does it last? What are the complications down the road? What's the overall quality of life for patients years later? The option trial is a great start, but it's really just the beginning.
It's like we opened a door to a whole new room, full of possibilities, but we still have to explore every corner.
That's a perfect way to put it. And I'm sure researchers all over the world are already looking into these questions, trying to fill in the gaps and get a better understanding of how LAC fits into the whole stroke prevention picture.
Speaking of exploring, one thing I'm curious about is the cost. I imagine a procedure like LAAC is more expensive up front than a prescription for blood thinners. Does that factor into the decision making?
It's a good question, and it's something doctors and patients will need to talk about. LAC might cost more at first, but you also have to think about potential savings in the long run.
Oh, interesting. So you're saying it could actually save money over time, even though the procedure itself is more expensive. How does that work?
Well, if LAC can successfully reduce those bleeding complications, then you have fewer doctor visits, fewer hospital stays, less need for other treatments. All of that can add up over time.
Okay, I see. So it's not just about the initial cost. It's about the overall cost over the long term. That's important to think about, especially for people who are concerned about healthcare expenses.
Absolutely. And it's another way this research can lead to better conversations about healthcare decisions.
So LAAC isn't just about a device. It's about a new way of thinking, a new way of looking at stroke prevention that considers not just the medical stuff, but also the personal, the financial, even the ethical points of treatment.
Got it. This research is making us think bigger and deeper about stroke prevention.
It's amazing how one study can lead to so many questions and possibilities. But let's take a step back and recap. The ablation trial shows that LAA could be a safe and effective alternative to blood thinners for preventing strokes in people with atrial fibrillation who've had ablation. But there's still a lot to learn about how this all fits together, right? It's not like LAAC is a perfect solution for everyone, and research is still going on to figure out who gets the most benefit and what happens in the long run. Am I thinking about this the right way?
You are exactly right. And that's what's so cool about science. It's a constant process of discovering new things. The ablation trial shows us a new path for stroke prevention, but it also brings up new questions. And those questions will lead to even more research.
It's like we just found a brand new continent. We know the land is there, but we have to map it all out, understand what it's like, and figure out the best way to get around.
I love that analogy. And speaking of getting around, how do you think all of this will change how people talk to their doctors? What advice would you give to someone trying to decide between LAAC and blood thinners?
Well, I think the first thing is don't be afraid to ask questions. The more you know, the better you can decide what's right for you.
Absolutely. Anyone facing this decision should come prepared. Write down your questions for your doctor. Like, what are my risks for stroke and bleeding? What are the pros and cons of each treatment? And if I choose LAC, what should I expect during and after the procedure?
Right. And it's important to be honest with your doctor about what you're worried about and what you prefer. Are you worried about the side effects of blood thinners? Do you get anxious about having a procedure? Those are all normal feelings. Your doctor needs to know about them so they can help you make the best decision.
It's also really important to talk about your lifestyle and any other health problems you might have. Some people have trouble sticking to the strict routine of blood thinners, while others might have conditions that make LAAC not the best choice.
So it's all about having an open and honest conversation with your doctor. Weigh the pros and cons of each option and find the solution that works best for you and your situation.
Exactly. And the option trial gives us a great starting point for those conversations. It's like having a new tool in the toolbox, one that might be safer and just as effective as blood thinners.
Okay, so we've talked about what it means for individuals, but taking a bigger view, what do you think about the wider implications of this research? Could LAC actually become the standard way to prevent strokes and atrial fibrillation?
It's hard to say for sure right now, but it's definitely a possibility. As we get more data and see how things turn out in the long term, we might see changes in those clinical practice guidelines and even insurance policies.
So LAC could really shake things up in cardiology.
It could definitely change how we think about stroke prevention and atrial fibrillation.
Not just for individual patients,
but for the whole healthcare system.
Now, I can't help but wonder, are there any downsides or problems we should be thinking about? As LAC becomes more common,
one challenge will be making sure everyone can get the procedure. LAA requires special training and equipment, and it might not be available everywhere, especially in rural areas or places with limited resources.
That's a really important point. We don't want a situation where only some people can access this treatment.
Exactly. And we also need to figure out the long-term monitoring and follow-up care. Even after LAAC, patients will need regular checkups to make sure the device is working properly and to catch any problems early on.
So it's not a one-time fix. It's a commitment to ongoing care.
Right, just like with any chronic condition.
And like with any new medical technology, there's always a learning curve for both doctors and patients. We need to keep gathering data, improve our methods, and make sure that LAAC is being used the right way and safely. It's amazing how one study can lead to so many conversations and new things to explore. But I want to bring it back to you, the listener, for a minute.
Yes, this is where it all comes together.
Exactly. We've given you a lot to think about today, and it can feel overwhelming. So as you're processing everything, think about what really stands out to you. What questions do you have about atrial fibrillation, stroke prevention, and LAAC? What's important to you when it comes to your health?
Remember, this information is here to help you, not to scare you. The more you know, the more confident you can be in making decisions about your care.
And don't forget, this is a journey. Atrial fibrillation is complicated, and there's no quick fix. But with the right knowledge, the right support, and the right treatment plan, you can still live a full and active life.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep advocating for your health. That's what the deep dive is all about. Until next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Heartbeat Podcast, where we uncover the science behind every beat. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform to stay updated with our latest discussions and insights. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, feedback, or questions, and let's continue exploring the pulse of modern cardiology together. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep your heart healthy.